Stuart Little by E.B. Webb. Chapter 1. In the Drain. When Mrs. Frederick C. Little's second son arrived, everyone noticed he was not much bigger than a mouse. The truth of the matter was, the baby looked very much like a mouse in every way. He was only about 2 inches high, and he had a mouse's sharp nose, a mouse's tail, a mouse's whiskers, and a pleasant, shy manner of a mouse. Before he was many days old, he was not only looking like a mouse, but acting like one too, wearing a gray hat and carrying a small cane. Mr. and Mrs. Little named him Stuart, and Mr. Little made a tiny bed out of 4 clothespins and a cigarette box. Unlike most babies, Stuart could walk as soon as he was born. When he was a week old, he could climb lamps by scurrying up the cord. Mrs. Little saw right away that infant clothes that she provided would be unsuitable, and she set to work to make him a fine little blue waisted suit, and with patch pockets in which he could keep his handkerchief, his money, and his keys. Every morning before Stuart dressed, Mrs. Little went to his room and weighed him on a little scale which was meant for weighing letters. At birth, Stuart could have been sent first-class mail for 3 cents. But his parents preferred to keep him rather than send him away. And when, at an age of a month, he had gained only 1/3 of an ounce, his mother was so worried she sent for the doctor. The doctor was delighted with Stuart and said that it was very unusual for an American family to have a mouse. He took Stuart's temperature and found it to be 98.6, which was normal for a mouse. He also examined Stuart's chest and heart and looked into his ears solemnly with a flashlight. Not every doctor can look into a mouse's ear without laughing. Everything seemed to be all right, and Mrs. Little was pleased to find such a good report. "Feed him up," said the doctor cheerfully, and he left. The home of the Little family was a pleasant place near a park in New York City. In the mornings the sun streamed through the east windows, and the Littles were up early as a general rule. Stuart was a great help to his parents and his older brother George, because of his size, because he could do things that a mouse could do, and was agreeable about doing them. One day when Mrs. Little was washing out the bathtub after Mr. Little had taken a bath, she lost a ring off her finger and was horrified to discover that it had fallen down the drain. "What had I better do?" she cried, trying to keep the tears back. "If I were you," said George, "I would bend a hairpin in the shape of a fishhook and tie it to the piece of a string and try to fish the ring out of it." So Mrs. Little found a piece of string and a hairpin, and for a half hour she tried fishing for the ring. But it was dark down the drain, and the hook always seemed to catch on something before it got down to where the ring was. "What luck?" inquired Mr. Little, coming into the bathroom. "No luck at all," said Mrs. Little. "The ring is too far down that I can't fish it up." "Why don't we send Stuart down after it?" suggested Mr. Little. "How about it, Stuart? Would you like to try?" "Yes, I would," Stuart replied, "but I think I'd better get into my old pants. I imagine it's wet down there." "It's all of that," said George, who was a trifle annoyed that his hook idea hadn't worked. So Stuart slipped into his old pants and prepared to go down the drain after the ring. He decided to carry the string along with him, leaving one end in the charge of his father. "When I jerk 3 times with the string, pull me up," he said. And while Mr. Little knelt in the tub, Stuart slid easily down the drain and was lost from view. In a minute or so, there were 3 quick jerks on the string, and Mr. Little carefully hauled it up. There, at the end, was Stuart with a ring safely around his neck. "Oh, my brave little son," said Mrs. Little proudly, as she kissed Stuart and thanked him. "How was it down there?" asked Mr. Little, who was always curious to know about the places he had never been to. "It was all right," said Stuart. "But the drain made him very slimy, and it was necessary for him to take a bath and sprinkle himself with a little bit of his mother's violet water before he felt himself again. Everybody in the family thought he had been awfully good with the whole thing." Chapter 2. Home Problems. Stuart was very helpful when it came to ping-pong. The Littles liked ping-pong, but the ball had a way of rolling under chairs, sofas, and radiators, and this meant the players were forever stooping down and reaching under things. Stuart soon learned to chase the balls, and it was a great sight to see him coming out from under a radiator, pushing a ping-pong ball with all of his might, and perspiration rolling down his cheeks. The ball, of course, was almost as high as he was, and he had to throw the whole weight against it in order to keep it rolling. The Littles had a grand piano in their living room, which was all except for one of the keys was sticky and didn't work properly. Mrs. Little said that she thought it might be the damp weather, but I don't see how it could be damp weather for a key to be sticking for about 4 years, during which time there had been many bright and clear days. But anyway, the key stuck, and it was a great inconvenience to anyone playing the piano, and it bothered George particularly when he was playing the scarf dance, which was rather lively. It was George who had the idea of stationing Stuart inside the piano to push the key up the second it was played. This was no easy job for Stuart, as he had to crouch down between the felt hammers so he wouldn't get hit on the head. But Stuart liked it just the same. It was exciting inside the piano, dodging about, and the noise was quite terrific. Sometimes, after a long session, he would emerge quite deaf and thought that he had just stepped out of an airplane after a long journey. And it would again be a little time before he really felt normal again. Mr. and Mrs. Little often discussed Stuart quietly between themselves when he wasn't around, for they never quite recovered from the shock and surprise of having a mouse in the family. He was very tiny and presented so many problems to his parents. Mr. Little said that one thing, it must be no references to mice in their conversation. He made Mrs. Little tear from the nursery book the page about the 3 blind mice, see how they run. I don't want Stuart to get a lot of notions in his head, said Mr. Little. I should feel badly to have my son grow up fearing the farmer's wife and going to cut off his tail with a carving knife, and such things to make children dream bad dreams when they go to bed at night. Yes, replied Mrs. Little, and I think we'd better start thinking about the poem, "'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse." I think it might embarrass Stuart to hear mice mentioned in such a belittling manner. That's right, said her husband. But what shall we say when we come to that line in the poem? We have to say something. And we can't just say, "'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring." That doesn't sound complete. It needs a word to rhyme with house. What about a louse? Asked Mrs. Little. Or grouse, said Mr. Little. I suggest souse, remarked George, who had been listening to the conversation from across the room. It was decided that louse was the best substitute for mouse, and soon, when Christmas came around, Mrs. Little carefully rubbed out the word mouse from the way of the poem and wrote in the word louse. And Stuart always thought the poem went this way. "'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a louse." The thing that worried Mr. Little the most was the mouse hole in the pantry. This hole had been made by some mice in the days before the Littles came to live in the house, and nothing had been done about stopping it up. Mr. Little was not sure he understood Stuart's real feelings about the mouse hole. He didn't know where the hole led to, and it made him uneasy to think that Stuart might some day feel the desire to venture into it. "After all, he does look a great deal like a mouse," Mr. Little said to his wife, "and I have never seen a mouse yet that didn't go into that hole." Chapter 3. Washing Up. Stuart was an early riser. He was almost always the first person up in the morning. He liked the feeling of being the first one stirring. He enjoyed the quiet rooms with the books standing still on their shelves, the pale light coming through the windows, and the fresh smell of day. In winter-time, it would be quite dark when he climbed from his bed made out of a cigarette box, and he sometimes shivered in the cold and stood on his nightgown doing his exercises. Stuart touched his toes 10 times every morning to keep himself in good condition. He had seen his brother George do it, and George had explained that it kept his stomach muscles firm and was a fine abdominal thing to do. After exercising, Stuart could slip his handsome wool wrapper and tie the cord around his waist and start for the bathroom. Creeping silently through the dark hall and past his mother and father's room, past the hall closet where the carpet sweeper was kept, past George's room and along the head of the stairs until he got to the bathroom. Of course, the bathroom would be dark too. But Stuart's father had thoughtfully tied a little string in the pull chain of the light. The string reached clear to the floor, and by grasping it as high up as he could and throwing his whole weight into it, Stuart was able to turn on the light. Swinging on the string this way, with his long bathrobe trailing around his ankles, he looked like a little friar pulling the bell rope of an abbey. To get to the wash basin, Stuart had climbed a tiny rope ladder which his father had fixed for him. George had promised to build Stuart a very small special wash basin, only 1 inch high, and with a little rubber tube through which the water would flow. But George was always saying he was going to build something and then forgot about it. Stuart just went ahead and climbed the rope ladder to his family wash basin every morning to wash his face and hands and brush his teeth. Mrs. Little had provided him with a doll-sized toothbrush, a doll-sized cake of soap, and a doll-sized washcloth, and a doll's comb, which he used to comb his whiskers. He carried those things in his bathrobe pocket, and when he reached to the top of the ladder, he took them out and laid them neatly in a row. Set about the task of turning on the water, for a small fellow, turning on the water was quite a problem. He had discussed it with his father one day about making several unsuccessful attempts. "I could get up to the faucet all right," he explained, "but I can't seem to turn it on, because I have nothing to brace my feet against." "Yes, I know," his father replied, "and that's the whole trouble." George, who always listened to conversations whenever he could, said it was his opinion that they ought to construct a brace for Stuart, and with that he got some boards, a saw, a hammer, and a screwdriver, and a brawlac, and some nails, and started to make a terrific fuss in the bathroom, building what he said was going to be a brace for Stuart. But he soon became interested in something else and disappeared, leaving the tools lying all around the bathroom floor. Stuart, after examining the mess, turned to his father again. "Maybe I could pound the faucet with something and turn it on in that way," he said. So Stuart's father provided him with a very small light hammer made of wood, and Stuart found that by swinging on it 3 times around his head and letting it come down with a crash on the handle of the faucet, he could start a thin stream of water flowing, enough to brush his teeth in anyway and moisten his washcloth. So every morning, after climbing to the basin, he would seize the hammer and pound the faucet, and the other members of the household were dozing in their beds, would hear the bright, sharp pink, pink, pink of Stuart's hammer, like a faraway blacksmith telling them the day had come and Stuart was trying to brush his teeth.